So at the outset, I'd like to thank MOS, Swapnesh and Ragini Madam for giving us this opportunity. This is a UVR based session and it's like a mixed bag that we are having here. I'm sure it will be an enjoyable session. So I'll be starting first. Let me share my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, Sharan.
Right. So I'll be talking on the enigma of retinitis, right? And at the outset, let me tell you this approach that I have kept. It's going to be, trying to keep things very simple and brief. We'll try to keep only clinical based findings and avoid complicating it with OCT and FFA things. And I would strongly recommend this course conducted by LV Prasad Eye Institute for anybody who wants to know anything about uveitis. It's a wonderful course, and I think everybody who's interested must give it a thought. To begin with, as we all know, retinitis is nothing but inflammation of the retina, and most probably it also involves the adjacent structures. Right now, there could be different types of retinitis. You could have focal infiltrates, you could have full thickness retinal involvement. It could be unifocal or multifocal. It could be retinitis standalone, or it could be chorioretinitis or retinochoroiditis. Importantly, it could also be infectious or non-infectious. Now, the golden rule to remember here is that unless proven otherwise, retinitis is always infectious. So whenever you think of retinitis, you have to think of an infectious cause. Just to quickly go through the common differentials that many may get confused. To begin with, there could be myelinated nerve fibers, but you have to understand these have this typical feathery edges out here, usually lack of any other lesions, and the patients are usually asymptomatic. Cotton wool spots have been nothing but small infarcts of the nerve fiber layer. So there will be small points here and there, usually associated with other hemorrhages because they are associated with systemic diseases like hypertension and diabetes. Retinitis, on the other hand, will have fluffy borders. There will be accompanying inflammation of some sort, probably with hemorrhages, and the patients will present with some decreased vision. The other way of looking at it is the level of the lesion. What is the depth of the lesion? If it's extremely deep with a bump there seen on the choroid, then you could think of a posterior scleritis. You will see the vessels comfortably pass over the lesions. Similarly, for a choroiditis, the vessels will be passing over the lesions, and again, it will be at a deeper level, and an elevation would not be seen here. Retinitis are superficial, so the vessels would definitely be obscured, and there could be accompanying retinal hemorrhages. Having established that it is retinitis, there are a lot of infectious and non-infectious causes, but for lack of time, we would be sticking to the most important causes today, that is the toxoplasma and the viral retinitis. If we look at the toxoretinochoroiditis, it is usually found in immunocompetent patients. The lesions are small, unifocal, and at the posterior pole. Usually there is lack of hemorrhages, and you could also see confluent vasculitis. There could be anterior segment involvement here as well. If it's a recurrence, then there would be dense vitritis and what typically known as the headlight in fog appearance. And you would also see an adjacent scar of the previous infection. But if it's a first episode, the vitritis could be minimal and a no scar may also be seen. And the lesions heal with pigmentation, and many times patient just present with a scarred lesion and just representing an old toxo infection. Now, IgG for toxo positivity doesn't mean much, but a negative IgG may help to rule out toxoplasma as a cause. But it is important to remember it appears positive 1 or 2 weeks after the infection. IgM is an indicator for active infection. Anything unusual that you find in your the presentation of the patient, then you should consider HIV, because even in immunosuppressed patients, toxo may be present. Treatment is usually Bactrim or Septran along with oral steroids. The point to remember is that steroids have to start after and end before the course of antibiotics. Intravitreal clindamycin may also be used, especially if the macula is getting involved, or in pregnancy where oral cannot be given, along with oral spiramycin. Moving on to viral retinitis, we are discussing the three main types, that's CMV, ARN, and CON. If you look at CMV retinitis, it is seen in immunocompromised patients, usually with CD4 counts less than 50. And generally, there is no anterior segment inflammation which is seen. Now, the lesions start at the periphery and spread slowly. There is no significant vitritis. There are white borders with central clearing. And there are definitely associated hemorrhages. The three different forms which are described, one is the fulminant form, giving rise to a typical pizza pie appearance. Then it could be an indolent or a granular variant where there are multiple small retinal lesions seen, or it could be the frosted branch angiitis, which is a rare variant. And all this leaves behind atrophic and necrotic retina, which can further lead to retinal detachment. Treatment for all viral retinitis include an induction phase for initial 2 to 3 weeks, where the doses are a little higher. And then there is a maintenance phase to prevent reactivation. In immunocompromised patients, antiretroviral treatment would also be required. IV ganciclovir can be used, but generally oral valganciclovir is the preferred because of no need for hospitalization. Moving on to acute retinal necrosis, it is necrotizing retinitis in immunocompetent individuals caused mainly by VZV and HSV viruses. There is rapid onset ocular pain and anterior segment manifestations are prominently seen with pigmented KPs, raised IOP, and anterior scleritis. The systemic history or past history can give some clue as to what organism it could be. Posterior segment, there is severe vitritis. Lesions are in the far to mid peripheral retina. There is occlusive arteritis and hemorrhages are rarely seen. Optic neuropathy and RD is very commonly seen in these cases. Treatment is by oral valacyclovir. In severe cases, there is a role for intravitreal ganciclovir and oral steroids as well. Finally, coming to PON, it is mainly caused by VZV in immunocompromised patients. The course is fulminant and visual prognosis is poor. These are multifocal deep lesions with involvement of the posterior pole early on. And there is a perivascular lucency which gives rise to a cracked mud appearance. Treatment is difficult with a single agent, so multiple agents are required along with intravitreal treatment, and of course hard treatment would also be required. Briefly, in testing for these retinitis, these are the tests that you would be doing. You need to rule out syphilis and TB as a cause. AC parasynthetase or vitreous tap can be done for PCR, and at times you may require FFA OCT and neurological evaluation. In conclusion, I'm going to end with a stepwise algorithm for approaching retinitis. Try to keep it simple, but of course you have to understand there could be variation seen. Now, if the patient is a healthy patient with significant anterior segment involvement and vitritis, and there is vasculitis, confluent or occlusive, we need to think in terms of toxo or ARN. On the other hand, if the patient is immunocompromised with minimal anterior segment involvement, minimal vitritis, hardly any vasculitis, then we should think in terms of CMV or PORN. Now, in this category further, if the area involved is small at posterior pole, variable visual loss, progression is slow, and retinal hemorrhages are few, and you get a typical headlight in fog appearance, you would think more in terms of toxo. On the other hand, if the lesions are large, peripheral, severe visual loss, and rapid progression is seen with multiple retinal hemorrhages, what is known as a late Swiss cheese appearance, then ARN would be the thought line. In the immunocompromised patients, if the lesions are peripheral with a late visual loss, slowly progressive, multiple hemorrhages is a pizza pie appearance, you would think in terms of CMV. While if the posterior pole is involved early and there is rapid progression and a cracked mud-like appearance, then PORN would be the thought process. And then you treat as I've just described. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharan. That was a wonderful presentation. I would take this opportunity to thank and invite Somashila Murthy, madam. It's an honor to have you on our panel, madam. There's no need to introduce her, but just for the newer retina aspiring people, we should know that madam has a rich experience of more than 15 years as faculty at LVPI, and she is a very much a Mumbai girl, where she has done her post-graduation as well as undergraduation from Nair and Sion Hospital. And then she went on to US, where she was a faculty at Doheny Eye Institute, California. Madam, it's a privilege for us that you have accepted the invitation And Dr. Ragini Parikh madam is also here. She would like to say a few words. Madam, you are muted. Madam, you are muted.
Very well said, Swapnesh. And I think we are really proud of her because she's a Mumbai girl. Welcome back to your home.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Swapnesh, for your very kind words. And thank you, Dr. Ragini and Sharan, for having me here. And of course, the minute I got the invitation, I was more than happy to be part of this very important session.
Hopefully we'll meet in person soon.
I hope so too. Sharan, that was an excellent talk. I think you covered mainly infectious causes of retinitis very well. And the last slide of yours just about summed it up. In fact, my question to you was going to be that how can a general ophthalmologist, figure out between all of these, and you just covered it beautifully in your last slide. So thank you for that.
Thank you, madam. Yeah, next I would like to call upon my friend Dr. Yogesh Patil, who is an excellent VR surgeon practicing at Advanced Eye Hospital, Navi Mumbai, to give the next talk. And he's going to talk on unsolved mystery of vitreous haze.
Thank you, Sharan. Thank you so much for this wonderful session. And thank you, Swapnesh, for putting it all together.
Thank you. Thank you, madam, for the opportunity. I'm not seeing Yogesh here. I thought you had logged in.
We can move on to the next.
Yeah, we can move on. Madam, I think it would be better if you could, if you could take over. I think Swapnesh has already introduced you, so I need not speak more. I think you can start with your presentation.
Sure. So as Sharan started off by saying that this is kind of a potpourri of uvea. So we're going all the way from anterior to posterior, and also we're going to talk about scleritis. So I thought I'll try to speak on my favorite topic first, and this is about scleritis. And I thought I'll try to keep it sort of more engaging to the audience if I simply discuss real life cases that we had. Sharan, am I sharing my screen? Is it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It seems.
Thank you. So, everybody is familiar with this classification from Watson and Hare, which talks about scleritis, then divides it as infectious and then non-infectious. And then when it's non-infectious, you have anterior, posterior, and then you have non-necrotizing and necrotizing. So the ones that I've highlighted here are just that with experience and with these cases that we have seen, I thought that it would be worthwhile to include a few more in this classification. So when you talk about scleritis, nowadays we might see the rare masquerade, which may have associated scleritis, or which may be looking like scleritis, like a mimicker. And we often say anterior and posterior scleritis, but sometimes we see such fulminant scleritis that, just like pan-uveitis, some of us have started calling them as sort of a pan-scleritis. And under the necrotizing variety, just wanted to point out that, how the textbook says without inflammation, especially say for the patients with rheumatoid arthritis, but actually it's without clinical inflammation, because if you go and take this biopsy, you will definitely see inflammatory cells. And the surgically induced necrotizing scleritis and surgically induced diffuse scleritis were not included in this original classification. So I thought it'll be interesting to put it in here. And we have published this in a textbook that has just come out on inflammation in general. So let's go to case one of a 37-year-old lady who had symptoms which had become quite severe. She had it since a year. She had undergone cataract surgery 2 years ago. And her systemic entities that she had was that over a period of time, not at her first instance itself, but she gradually developed nasal septal involvement in the form of inflammation of the nasal septum and collapse of the bridge of the nose. And she continued to have this lower limb relapsing myalgias. So this was her entry-level pictures where she had diffuse scleritis, as well as what you can see prominently is the peripheral infiltrates on the cornea. So we diagnosed her as scleritis with corneal involvement, and we investigated her thoroughly, and we started her on oral medications. But despite all that, the patient continued to go on having these relapsing episodes. So this patient I have in follow-up for 17 years now. So 2 years from the initial presentation when she had this saddle nose deformity, then we could pick up the diagnosis of relapsing polychondritis for her. And after multiple medications, we finally started the patient on tocilizumab. And with that, she's stabilized. And just before lockdown, she had come in and she seemed to be doing well. She's on teleconsultation too. So this was a case of a very chronic kind of a disease, relapsing polychondritis with scleritis. The second patient is somewhat similar, as in the systemic etiology of this patient. She has granulomatosis polyangiitis, which is what we used to call as Wegener's. And she presented with severe necrotizing scleritis. In fact, the thought was whether to do a patch graft or not. But we did not do a patch graft for her. We started her on oral steroids. She also had recent tuberculosis, so we couldn't start her on cyclophosphamide. And after a while, the scleritis component went down significantly. Of course, there's a staphyloma formation, but the patient was doing very well till she succumbed in 2018 due to aspergillosis of the lungs. So she had a lot of systemic morbidity. Can you have infectious causes? Yes, you can. Sometimes it can be subtle like this. So this patient gave history of pigmented, history of typical rash over the forehead on one side, and the same eye was affected. And so this is obviously when you have such a symptomatology, you know, you're dealing with herpes zoster ophthalmicus. He did not have any other neurological symptoms, but he did have these peripheral corneal infiltration in the cornea. And then the patient was on oral steroids, not getting better. So this particular patient, we started on oral acyclovir as well. This was the OCT showing that this is the anterior part, and you can see that this is not as thickened, but the posterior part is very thickened. And once we started the patient on therapy, there was gradual resolution and the patient quietened down. So this was a different case. What about fulminant infections? We probably see them a little bit more than the West. So this patient had history of mud falling into the eye, and then the patient came to us with these necrotic looking white patches from which we could isolate Pseudomonas species. Again, it took us a very long time to get the patient to quieten down. In fact, at one point, we even thought of starting the patient on immunomodulators and oral steroids, but subsequently the patient settled down with amikacin. And that was because we had a microbiological diagnosis for this patient. Another similar case where there was history of trauma turns out could well turn out to be fungal keratitis. In this particular instance, we had a patient with a stick injury and multiple scrapings were negative. Finally, we got separate fungal filaments. And on starting the patient with treatment, there was rapid resolution. So I think bacterial and fungal keratitis, scleritis have been fairly common in patients because many of our patients are in the agricultural background. All right, coming to an unusual case of a patient, he did give history of injury. He did say that he had some kind of systemic component like joint inflammation. So, but what he had was this very dense white looking lesion. Now, at that time, it was diagnosed as scleritis. But now that I show you the pictures, you know that this doesn't look like the previous pictures of scleritis. And indeed, it was not. So we did extensive workup and then even did the scleral deroofing. But the patient did not get better at all. And you can see that there is extension of the lesion here. Ultimately, it dawned on us that this is looking like a masquerade. And our oncology colleagues as well saw the case. This patient turned out to have diffuse OSSN. He systemically had HBsAg positive. And unfortunately, it was so diffuse with orbital involvement that the patient had to undergo an exentration. This was the exentrated specimen. So these are the various different cases that I had of scleritis to present to you. So it runs from infection to what you expect as inflammation, and it can sometimes end with these very rare cases of masquerade. So the masquerade is an exception. What you commonly see would be a sort of a garden variety immune-mediated diffuse scleritis most of the time. But watch out if the patient has history of trauma or if the patient has history of recent surgery, especially pterygium surgery or the older kind of vitreoretinal surgery or a retinal belt buckle in place, then think about an infectious component. So that was what I had to share, sir, if you want to take over.
Thank you, madam, for that wonderful talk. Yes, Swapnesh, want to say something?
Sharon, can I ask one question to?
Yeah,
Of course.
Yeah, madam, how to make best use of OCT in cases of scleritis? How to make optimum use of OCT? Does it help to monitor or prognosticate the treatment?
Right. So the first part, I would say that don't depend on OCT, and especially for those of us who don't have OCT in our practice, you don't need it for scleritis. It does help. The OCT helps us because I am being a cornea anterior segment person. I anyway have the OCT with me. So I find it fairly useful, and we're just trying to finish up with our work on how to differentiate between episcleritis and scleritis using the OCT. alone without using, the person who's looking at those 3 images is unbiased, doesn't know the history. And then can you diagnose between episcleritis versus scleritis? Yes, it's fairly, it's pretty good. We got more than 90% in terms of sensitivity and specificity. The second way to diagnose for me, for my patients, is in the management. So clinically, the patient might still have symptoms, but you might see that on OCT, the amount of edema has gone down. So there are a lot of, it's still unexplored. And I think that we cannot really differentiate between the infectious versus the immune mediated, especially if you have a huge nodule. But it is probably more useful for those borderline cases, whether it's episcleritis or scleritis, and it's more useful to monitor the therapy for these patients. I hope that answered your question, Swapnesh.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
And would you like to continue with your next talk, viral anterior uveitis?
Sure. Are there any other questions in the meanwhile?
No, ma'am, you can go ahead with the next one.
All right. So moving on to the second part of what I wanted to speak on, what I like to speak on, is about a fairly under-recognized entity. And this is viral endothelitis or viral anterior uveitis. The next time each of you goes to clinic, I want you to pay attention to the cases that come in. And perhaps we've been missing these cases a lot. We've been labeling them as granulomatous anterior uveitis, labeling them as glaucoma, maybe steroid responders, and also considering that entity of Forstner-Schlossman syndrome. So all of these are nothing but a viral endothelitis. And when you have a patient with this kind of clinical presentation that I'm going to show you, rest assured that it's going to be a viral infection. You just need to figure out which virus so that you can start the appropriate antiviral. So let's go in very quickly with these few cases, or rather with a little bit of background first. What are the common viruses causing endothelitis or keratouveitis? These are all terminologies you can use. When the endothelium alone is affected without any stromal or any epithelial component, then I'd like to call it as endothelitis. If there is a past stromal scarring or current stromal scarring, then you have a keratouveitis. And if the patient presents only with the keratic precipitates and some amount of anterior uveitis, secondary glaucoma, then we can label them as anterior uveitis. But we are pretty much talking about the same culprits. So we need to also know how to diagnose between viral and non-viral, as well as amongst the viruses, which are the ones that could be causing it. And so therefore, we'll go through some cases, which I think always teach us a lot. And if we have time, we'll go through the management. So the commonest viruses that can cause endothelitis or keratouveitis, I'm just going to use endothelitis, which represents all of the others that I mentioned, would be, of course, herpes simplex type 1, varicella zoster virus, and cytomegalovirus. Rubella virus is more in the context of Fuchs heterochromic cystitis. And then there are rare viruses, but nevertheless, they do exist. And perhaps it's harder to pick up these viruses, especially Epstein-Barr has been reported, and also chikungunya virus has been reported as causes of a viral, maybe anterior uveitis. That you will only know because the patient might present with other symptomatology related to that disease. And certainly I would put the SARS coronavirus also under this category, where you can have a viral anterior uveitis. So let's go to the common viruses. I'm not going to talk about the SARS coronavirus at all here, but the commonest ones that we're going to see in our clinic would be HSV, VZV, and CMV. These are the commonest causes. So how do you differentiate between them? So whenever you have a patient with maybe history of recurrent keratitis, so there could be some corneal lesions or scarring or footprint scars. There could, hypoesthesia is a very common feature, as you know, in HSV, and do test the corneal sensations of all these patients that come to us. Or you can have the patient with a disciform, a classic disciform kind of a keratitis. The keratic precipitates are always there. They can usually range between small to medium, and they're very often pigmented, like in this example here. And there would be a very moderate AC reaction, not fulminant. But if you don't treat it, then yes, the reaction gets much more fulminant. And the intraocular pressure is moderately raised. So it would be about 30s or something like that. So you have a patient with secondary glaucoma and the symptomatology, you might lean more towards HSV. So this is about HSV. What about the second entity, that is VZV? So VZV can be seen both in the immunocompromised, for example, in HZO, or it can also be seen in the immunocompetent. So it's not necessary to see only in the immunocompromised. So here it is a little bit more classical when you have those that moth-eaten pattern of the iris. The iris trans illumination defect. So that is due to VZV, because the depigmentation that happens is much more, and it's sectoral. And you can also have this very florid and slightly ugly looking mass of keratic precipitates, which are very large. And you can have pseudodendrites, you can have nummulokeratitis associated with it, especially with the HZO, when they have HZO. And raised IOP, sometimes IOP can be very high also, very highly raised, like 40s, 50s, and so on. So these are the patients where you can think about VZV etiology or even HZO etiology. Coming to the most under-recognized entity, the third one, that is CMV endothelitis. So this is an entity that I got very interested in because of seeing publications from the Singapore group. And after that, when we looked at our patients very closely, you could see a number of patients coming in with these cases. And when I recall, I think that we have missed a lot of these patients because we labeled them as something else, or maybe viral, or maybe just anterior uveitis, and investigated them. So what is the symptomatology here? They have years of history, maybe 1 year, 2 years. They have coin-shaped or linear or granulomatous KPs, very minimal AC reaction, and super high pressure. So pressures in the 50s or even 60s. And during the episode, when they come in with this kind of KPs and so on, the speculars, the endothelial cells are usually affected. So if you do a simple specular microscopy, you will see that the cells are affected. So this is very hallmark of CMV endothelitis. Surprisingly, in HSV, you don't really see this typical changes of the endothelial cells unless it is very, very chronic and the endothelial cells are damaged. So that is the entity of CMV endothelitis. I'll probably just go through one case and then end. So this was a child who presented with a hypopion uveitis. Initially, it was thought to be a masquerade, although the B scan was normal. And then next, it was thought to be JIA, because a pediatric patient with uveitis, we naturally think of JIA. So what we did was the AC fluid was sampled, and it showed chronic granulomatous inflammation. But at that point, we did not think of testing it for viruses. We didn't suspect it. But subsequently, we send a repeat sample. We send that for virology, and we got HSV1 positive for that. This is the histopathology from the first specimen. What it's showing here is these large sort of folded in cells, which are sort of the macrophages, which are pretty hallmark for viral etiology. So this child turned out to have herpetic anterior uveitis. Even it's so significant because it was not treated, that he presented with a hypopion. And so think of it even in pediatric cases that viral etiology could be one of the causes of uveitis in these pediatric cases. Another case is a patient who presented with diagnosis of chronic anterior uveitis, was only 36 years, and secondary glaucoma. So the patient presents to us with these, hardly anything you can see, just some small little keratic precipitates. But so what's very important here is the history. So the patient has recurrent episodes, everything else is negative, and the patient also has secondary glaucoma. And so we sent an AC tab, which was actually initially negative, but we anyway started the patient on oral acyclovir. So you don't have to have a positive virology on AC tab. Clinical suspicion, a strong clinical suspicion is good enough, because acyclovir, we are very familiar with how to use it. And it's not a very toxic drug, it's very well tolerated. And it's fairly cheap also. So you can use acyclovir or valacyclovir, whichever you prefer. And so with this patient, despite negative serology from the AC, despite negative virology from the AC tab, we were very convinced was viral based on the symptomatology. And we stopped all the anti-glaucoma medications over time. The patient could be taken off steroids and continues though to be on oral acyclovir. So now when the patients ask how long should I be on this drug, it's kind of hard to say, because most of the viral inflammations most of the drugs are only virostatic, they're not virucidal in that way. But one last point is that if it's CMV endothelitis, then valacyclovir or acyclovir will not work. We'll have to use valganciclovir for this patient. So the same patient didn't respond to oral acyclovir, then I would have probably switched to valganciclovir, which is much more expensive. So you need to convince the patient to take it. So that's all I have for this patient. Once again, thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to end on time.
Thank you, ma'am. That was wonderful. Madam, could you highlight what exactly do you mean by coin-shaped KPs? Means, just for somebody who has not seen it clinically, would you describe it, how it looks on slit lamp exactly?
Yeah, so coin-shaped KPs does not mean the huge, like a big coin or something like that. I would say that if you have, so you don't always have coin-shaped KPs, but if you have coin-shaped KPs, that is very pathognomic for CMV endothelitis. So let me just blow up this picture here. And this is more typical what we see. If you can see this little small keratic precipitate over here.
Yeah.
So these are more typical features. You just see some isolated but fairly large precipitates. So this kind of precipitate could be in a small little ring or a much larger than this. So that would call it a coin-shaped keratic precipitate. They're very tiny though.
And the ring is probably because of the localized corneal edema always.
No, the ring is again a host of keratic precipitates that conglomerate because those particular cells are affected by the disease. And this is what the specular would look like, as you have in this picture here, that the specular microscopy, this was because of the edema, you can't see anything, but as the patient improved, you can see that how bad the endothelial cell count looks like and the changes in the endothelial cells itself. So that is also classical for CMV endothelitis.
Thank you, ma'am. Sharon?
Yeah, I see Dr. Yogesh has logged in again. So I think he had some network
Yes,
issues.
yes.
Yeah. So Yogesh, you can start your presentation.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Is my screen visible?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh. Wait a minute. Now?
No.
Oh.
I think we'll move on to the next speaker, Yogesh.
Yeah. Please. I think, this is basically, there is some,
Okay.
please carry on. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Next speaker, I'd like to call Dr. Nikhil Beke, who's a VR surgeon and uveitis expert from Pune. He's received his training in retina and UV at PGI Chandigarh and is presently serving honorary consultant at HV Desai Hospital and Dinanath Mangeshkar Hospital at Pune. His areas of interest include diabetic retinopathy, ROP, and uveitis. He's going to enlighten us about the various therapeutic options in uveitis. Dr. Nicholson? Yeah, please carry on. We can't hear you. Dr. Beke, you're on mute.
Yeah, hope I'm audible now.
Yeah. Please carry on.
Yeah. So was going to talk on the infectious therapeutic options in uveitis. And largely, we grossly classify uveitis in two entities, infectious and non-infectious. And the treatment of infectious uveitis is relatively easy if the diagnosis is quickly and correctly achieved. So you have to treat the infection, you have to give steroids judiciously at the right time once the antimicrobials start acting. You have to monitor for the side effects, and you also have to think of the conditions that lead to immunosuppression, that lead to the infection, for example, the immune deficiency. So when it comes to non-infectious uveitis, this is where the trials and tribulations, both for the uveitis expert as well as for the patient, start, because both of them they need to know that they are in for a long haul. And to begin off, you need a good start. You need a good opening batsman to get a rapid control over the entity. But you also need an agent to sustain the effort, to win the long-term battle. So when it comes to the quick effect or the rapid onset of actions, nothing better than steroids. They quickly start their actions, but unfortunately, they can't be continued in the long run because you would be caught up. The steroid side effects start catching up. So you require another agent which would relatively, start its action relatively in a delayed manner, maybe at 4 to 6 weeks, but it would be feasible to give it over a long term for months and years without side effects. So steroids in chronic infectious, non-infectious entities are thought of once they are the first line of treatment for inducing remission. They also are useful for controlling each recurrence, and they are effective because they can be given multiple dosage forms. So if you want a rapid control of the inflammation for the sake of patient discomfort or vital tissues at risk, then one can think of methylprednisolone, which is given IV. And this is usually after getting the patient hospitalized. Once the initial acute phase is over, you can maintain the control for the short run on an OPD basis or with oral steroids. Usually the drug chosen by ophthalmologists is prednisolone, and it started at 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg and then tapered over a period of time. So what is inevitable is, especially when we are using prednisolone for more than 12.5 milligram per day for more than almost 3 months, then hypocortisolism catches up, which is commonly manifested in the terms of raised BP, raised sugars, osteoporosis, and gastric ulcers. But what is something which defies monitoring and which goes unnoticed is disturbed mental health and even psychosis at times. So now that we are all very fond of being vocal for local, ophthalmologists have also thought of treating the disease locally, and the commonest agent that initially people went for was triamcinolone acetonide, which had a good effect but also has significant local side effects, namely in terms of cataract and raised IOP, which can have cumulative effect. And a bigger problem was this gives you a bolus action, so a sudden rise in the action and then rapid waning of the effect. So you have this effect in peaks and troughs, whereas what you really need is a sustained plateau kind of effect in these cases. So the next thing that was thought of was Ozurdex, which is a sustained release 0.7 milligram dexamethasone implant, which is biodegradable and can be injected with a 22 gauge applicator, and because it has a relatively milder side effect profile, especially when it comes to IOP, because of its water soluble nature. So the claim duration is somewhere between 3 to 6 months. In clinical practice, we don't see it acting beyond 4 months. But in thinking even long term, there are a few entities which require immunosuppression beyond 4 months, and these are typically these entities where the recurrence is the norm, and even between the two clinically telltale recurrences, you do have ongoing tissue injury on a microscopic level. So the conventional immunosuppressives were thought of. These are typically used in all those cases which are responsive to steroids, but then they are recurrent, they are site-threatening, and steroid side effects are a serious problem. So usually we think of antimetaboloids, commonly used ones are methotrexate, azathioprine, and mycophenolate, and calcineurin inhibitors such as cyclosporin. And rarely, if you want a even rapid control of inflammation, then one can think of cytotoxic drugs like cyclophosphamide. And we are targeting lymphopenia here. So it requires a significant systemic workup prior to starting immunosuppressives. And usually they are started in liaison with a rheumatologist or an internist. And one needs to be aware that all these agents, they cause a significant bone marrow, liver, GI, and kidney toxicity. And at times certain tests might be needed to see if a specific agent is suitable for a given case. For example, one might think of doing a TPMT enzyme levels before starting azathioprine. And not only at the beginning, they also require monitoring while they are being used. So people routinely undertake serial monitoring of hemogram, LFT, RFTs on a regular basis. And the patient also needs to be alerted that he needs to report to the physician or the ophthalmologist if there are any unexpected symptoms or if there are any signs of infection. So thinking of month and year-long therapy, people thought of giving that locally in terms of fluocinolone acetonide implant, which is to be sutured to the sclera in a surgical procedure. But this was fraught with multiple side effects. So this is the implant. This has this pellet of fluocinolone acetonide. This was implanted surgically. But because of the multiple side effects such as cataract and raised IOP, this fell out of favor. And what took its place was a 25 gauge non-biodegradable implant, which is Iluvien, which also works for 36 months. So gives a good cover for almost 3 years. and this is approximately the size of it. So the newest kid in the block is biological response modifiers, which are essentially monoclonal antibodies acting against biological active mediators of immune response, namely such as cytokines. And they are indicated if the patient shows intolerance or inadequate response to conventional immunosuppression or has concomitant systemic disease such as Behçet's or juvenile idiopathic arthritis. And they work beautifully in Behçet's because TNF alpha takes a center stage in the pathogenesis of Behçet's. And any anti-TNF alpha antibody, which are two of them are quite commonly available. One is infliximab, which is chimeric antibody given IV, and adalimumab, which is a humanized antibody tolerated better, which is given in a subcutaneous manner like an insulin pen. Thankfully for both of them, biosimilars are available. And this can be used as a first-line agent. Instead of starting the patient with methylprednisolone and followed by oral steroids plus immunosuppressives, you can directly start off with anti-TNF alpha agent. And as a VR surgeon, I think it would be the treatment of uveitis would be incomplete unless we include vitrectomy as the as a treatment modality, where especially in those cases which are refractory to medical therapy. And this is done to clear the structural entities such as epiretinal membranes, tractional retinal detachments, dense PCO, and even for correction of hypotony. But this can also clear the media and at times this aids in diagnosis for in challenging cases such as lymphoma or even retinal necrosis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. That was a wonderful talk. Any questions anybody has?
Hi, Nikhil. How are you?
Hi, ma'am. Doing so well.
Good. I think you covered the talk wonderfully, Nikhil, pretty much including the latest aspects as well. So, and also you've highlighted that why steroids cannot be good for a long time. So I think more and more as ophthalmologists, we should try to start the patient on other immunomodulators and keep them only for the minimum possible time on steroids. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd just like to ask, what would be the indication for starting off straight away with, say, adalimumab, as against oral steroids and then followed by something else?
As I said, where the drug is particularly where the drug is targeting a cytokine, which plays a key role in, let's say, a disease called disease such as Behçet's disease, where you are specifically targeting the disease itself, the disease causing cytokine itself, instead of causing a broad spectrum lymphopenia.
So in our context, we very rarely go upfront with something like, say, adalimumab. There are very few indications for that. Let's say a pediatric patient where you really want to avoid oral steroids. But otherwise, it's not first-line therapy, and except for Behçet's, as he's pointed out. But otherwise, I think we would have tried some other agent before we go to adalimumab. But
Right.
in rheumatology medicine, they do use it as first-line. So it's only a matter of time, I think.
Okay, thank you.
It's been my observation that down south parts of India, we rarely get to see uveitis, the Behçet's uveitis in a very common way. Elsewhere, the and whenever it comes to us, it's usually through a rheumatologist who would have already started the patient on one of the biologics. It's getting very common with them.
Yeah, I agree with that. So you're muted, Sharam. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. So let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Girish Gadre, who's a VR surgeon practicing at Kolhapur and Kudal since 20 years. Did his MS from Bhopal and VR fellowship from SN. Presently, is also associate professor at Krishna Medical College, Karachi. He's received a BG Limay Award, YKC Pandit Award, and Best Video Award at different MOS conferences. He's going to speak to us about a very important topic of ocular TB. So you can please start.
Am I audible? Slides
Yes,
are visible
yes, you
now?
are. Yes, please.
Okay. So I will be starting my topic on ocular tuberculosis. I will be focusing only on the posterior segment, like posterior uveitis. Whenever we get a patient with a choroiditis patch, in that case, we need to look for the different lesions in the form of old choroiditis patches like this, some vasculitis patches like this, and one should focus on the 4 important things where anatomically the primary site of inflammation lies, how likely infectious etiology is, how site-threatening the inflammation is, and associated systemic diseases. So while focusing on ocular tuberculosis, collaborative ocular tuberculosis study has given us some guidelines and differentiated different types of uveitis patterns into multifocal choroiditis, choroidal tubercles, serpiginous-like choroiditis, retinal vasculitis, subretinal abscess, neuroretinitis, and intermediate uveitis. Whenever we get a case of multifocal choroiditis, I would like to present a few cases. This is a patient who had multiple episodes of multifocal choroiditis in the span of 5 years, presented initially with floaters and 6/6 vision. His Mantoux and chest X-ray was normal, which was done twice or thrice, and he had already lost his left eye with vision 3/60 and healed multifocal choroiditis patches. He developed retinal detachment in between, developed cataract, undergone retinal detachment surgery, cataract surgery. 2 years he was uneventful in between and developed arthritis, which was gouty arthritis. He had 2 more attacks of uveitis, developed diabetes because of multiple dosage of steroids, systemic as well as topical steroids. Then he presented with a 4th attack with recurrence with multifocal choroiditis patches with some vasculitis area. One can see buccal effect and a lot of exudates over that effect. On FFA, the importance of FFA is that one can see the activity in the at the margin of choroiditis patches. One can see when the patch is very near to fovea. One can see the staining in the vasculitis patches. After 3 months of the previous attack, he had a large multiple patches at fovea with a bleed at the margin. So we suspected it is a secondary CNVM due to choroiditis patches. There is a reactivation in left eye with few hemorrhages also. At this point of time, we insisted he was financially poor, so we insisted for quantiferon gold and CT scan. Ultimately, he got it done, and it turned out to be TB gold positive, and HRCT was also showing old pulmonary patches. So he was started on anti-tubercular treatment. And because we suspected it's a CNVM, we have given intravitreal Avastin, which responded very well. After 2 dosages of Avastin and starting of ATT, the lesions completely regressed. And one can see the complete scenario that after 5 years, we could diagnose it as a case of tuberculosis correctly, and the lesions completely regressed. But unfortunately, his vision lost to 3/16 both eyes. Another presentation could be tuberculoma, which manifests as a single or multiple yellowish subretinal lesion with fuzzy border with or without exudative fluid, typically located in the posterior pole. She is a lady of 16 years, history of foreign trip, AP status. Why I would like to specifically tell that many financially good peoples, they won't agree that they have a ocular tuberculosis, and they go for even investigation. So we treated it as a case of toxoplasma, even though there was no retinitis, even though there was no vitritis. All blood tests were normal, even TB gold and Mantoux was negative. She was partially responding to steroids, but again, she used to have 2 to 3 recurrences. One can see the active lesion with the temporal margin was active. And she had undergone AC type for PCR, which was positive, and started on anti-tubercular treatment. And ultimately, the lesion completely regressed. Third way by which tuberculosis can present is a serpiginous-like choroiditis, manifests as a multifocal, initially discrete and later confluent lesions, characterized by slightly raised edges showing active edge wave-like progression and central healing, typical like a serpiginous choroiditis. But slightly different part is that they are diffuse plaque-like, non-contagious to optic disc, and they are usually associated with mild vitritis. This is a case where patient presented with left eye vision drop, and the lesion is very near to fovea. Patient undergone investigation, thorough investigation, which he was Mantoux positive, so we started on ATT. And because the lesion is very near to fovea, we have started ivmethylprednisolone. He was not aware about his right eye lesions, but it possibly turned out to be a presumptive ocular tuberculosis. The patient responded very well. Another presentation could be multifocal choroiditis and serpiginous choroiditis combination. Our teacher, Dr. Biswas sir, used to call it as MPGS choroiditis, which is a combination of serpiginous choroiditis and multiple choroiditis. This could be a type of ocular tuberculosis presentation. Of course, this has not been described in Coates study. Another way by which ocular tuberculosis can present is a vasculitis, typically as a Eales disease, one of the differentials. Healthy young male patients with typical periphlebitis, capillary non-perfusion areas, neovascularization, recurrent vitreous hemorrhage, and fibrovascular proliferation, typically seen in Eales disease. It is a hypersensitive reaction, as we all know. The presence of perivascular choroidal pigment or small choroiditis patches is highly suggestive of tubercular etiology. Whenever we see a patient of Eales, before calling it as a Eales, if we see a choroiditis patches along the vessel, one must investigate thoroughly for the tuberculosis. Here is one interesting patient who treated for Eales disease elsewhere with steroid and laser, developed recurrent vitreous hemorrhage. MAN2 was negative. TB Gold was positive, started on ATT and intravitreal Razumab because he has a vitreous hemorrhage with oral steroids, and one can see there is a complete regression. I would like to stress on one important point that there is one area of subretinal lesion, which is a choroidal patch. It's tuberculoma that was also regressed. One can present tuberculosis as a neuroretinitis or choroidal tubercle. So we investigate patient. The gold standard is demonstration of mycobacteria, but it is not possible in our scenario because of lack of sample. In this setting, PCR is extremely helpful, but that is also invasive. So diagnosis of tubercular uveitis is mostly based on clinical and immunological investigation. These techniques are frequently used to reach a presumptive diagnosis. The baseline immunological testing include PPD, that is MAN2 test, and IGRS, interferon gamma release test. Both tests do not distinguish between active and latent disease. Interferon test is better in those who received BCG and already on steroids, but caution is required in the interpretation. Radiological imaging is extremely important. Usually we do X-ray chest, which is not of much help. So court study itself gives us a guideline that HRCT is extremely important, where we can pick up tuberculosis in around 68 to 70% patients. Ocular imaging is important, particularly fluorescein angiography, to look for activity, serpiginous type of cases, CNP areas to do scatter laser, presence of NVs and macular edema. OCT is important to look for anatomical location of lesion, particularly when it encroaches to fovea. Autofluorescence is one of the things where even though it is non-invasive, one can give activity whether the lesion is active or not. ICG has a limited role. When to start anti-tubercular treatment as per Court's trial in tubercular SLC, one positive immunological evidence is sufficient to start ATT. In tuberculoma, immunological evidence or when patient comes with endemic area with positive radiological finding, one can start ATT. Tubercular multifocal choroiditis is not very specific of tuberculosis, so one immunological test along with a radiological finding is necessary to start ATT. Other studies gives guideline that when patient has a vasculitis with patches of choroiditis along with vessel, one positive immunological evidence is sufficient. Recurrent tuberculosis transiently responding to steroid, patient is coming from endemic area, one can start anti-tubercular treatment with one immunological evidence. Use of INH with rifampicin as an empirical trial dose for a month, and if patient respond, one can also start ATT. The main issue is that physicians are not very they won't agree to start ATT unless patient has a radiological investigation. Normal dose of ATT is 2 months of 4 drugs and 6 months of 2 drugs. If no signs of regression, one can consider case as a multi-drug resistant. Corticosteroids and immunosuppressant has major role but should not be given alone. Paradoxical worsening can be seen in few cases on ATT. Local intravitreal steroids and anti-VEGF has limited role. There are new studies which shows that in tuberculoma there is a very high dose of VEGF. In that case, anti-VEGF agent along with the steroids are indicated. To conclude, Court study gives us better idea in defining different clinical presentation and its tubercular association. PPD and IGRS has an important role, should always be done. HRCT gives us more information than X-ray. ACTAP or vitreous tap for PCR is informative. ATT needs to be started soon as per Court's guidelines. Steroids has a major role in reducing inflammation along with ATT. Ocular tuberculosis can present in any form and should be timely diagnosed and treated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gadare, for this wonderful talk. We just have time, and Dr. Yogesh is just going to try once again if we can log in and make his presentation. Dr. Yogesh?
I'm just going to start the share screen.
Yeah.
I hope it's visible now.
I think it's getting shared. Yes, yes. Please go on.
Yeah. So I'll sum up as quickly as possible, and it will be, I think, very good case for all of us to discuss after all the gametes of uveitis have been studied as of now. So she was a 58-year-old lady presented with a complaints of decreased vision in both eyes. On presentation, the visual acuity was 660 N18 in the right eye and 624 N10 in the left eye. A significant only past ocular history was she has underwent a cataract surgery in both eyes, and that too was 10 years back. Systemically, she was a hypertensive, on treatment, well controlled. So the ocular finding, the anterior segment in both eyes was almost near normal kind of, and with little bit of an pigment deposits on the surface, anterior surface of the IOL. Vitreous has 2+ cells, hairs, the disc was hyperemic, and there was old perivascular sheathing, and that too was in mid-periphery. Left eye was little mildly affected, vitreous haze was only 1+ kind of, and the rest of the findings were almost similar. She underwent a complete course of an systemic evaluation for a uveitis workup. Everything turned out to be within the range except the ESR was at 50. So patient was started with oral steroid, topical steroids were started and was asked to come up after 2 weeks time. 2 weeks, the right eye has significantly responded. Visual acuity has improved to 6.9 N6. Left eye improved mildly only to 6.18 N10. Vitreous haze in both eyes has significantly reduced. Left eye did not improve because there was a macular edema kind of. As she has responded very well, I asked her to continue with the medicine and asked her to come up again after 2 weeks time. At 2 weeks, most of the findings remain similar. Visual acuity was same as a previous 6.9 N6 in the right eye and 6.18 in the left eye. Left eye, there was a residual macular edema with foveal detachment. As steroids were getting tapered off and she was on 10 milligram of steroids, she was advised to undergo Ozurdex in the left eye for the residual macular edema. Ozurdex was performed and she was asked to come up after a month's time. At the 1 month, everything was perfectly fine. The left eye vision has restored back to the 6.9 N6, right eye was 6.9 N6. On OCT, though there were very mild few cystoid changes, patient was happy, I was happy. She was put on a Nepafinac eye drop for the right eye residual edema and was asked to come up after 6 weeks time. Instead of 6 weeks, patient presented within 2 weeks only with decrease in the vision in the right eye, and this time the decrease was quite significant, which fall down to the 1 meter vision. Left eye was maintaining a good vision. The cause for the decreased vision in the right eye was a significant increase in the vitreous haze. It was almost 3+, where the retina was barely visible, wherever left was doing quite fine. The only new thing which has come up in the last few days was some hard exudates started appearing at the macula. So this time, considering this is a too short recurrence, I started patient with on azathioprine, considering the rapid recurrence kind of, along with the steroids. After 3 weeks of starting of oral steroid and azathioprine, vision significantly improved in the right eye from 1 meter to 6.18 N10. Vitreous haze has significantly reduced. The kind of an hard exudates which we saw in the left eye has now came up in the right eye also, but vision was pretty good and OCT was absolutely normal. At her next visit, there was a persistent CME in the right eye, and because of which the vision did not improve in the right eye beyond 6.18, which was at last visit, and that's why the patient was given Ozurdex in the right eye this time. And after the Ozurdex at 1 month's time, again the vision improvement has happened to the normalcy at around 6.9 N6. Steroids were gradually tapered off and azathioprine was continued. The moment steroids were tapered off, within 2 weeks time, she had another recurrence. And this time I referred patient to the rheumatologist just to see if at all I am missing out something. Rheumatologist again worked up on all the factors which can lead to this thing. Nothing came out to be very positive. Patient was started on tacrolimus kind of an along with the steroid, and the history got repeated. The moment we again stopped the steroid, in a short duration of time, she had a next recurrence. This time, rheumatologists along with azathioprine, tacrolimus has started with methotrexate with steroids. The moment steroid were stopped, the same thing got reoccurred kind of, and the vision has gone back to the decreased vision. That is right eye 636 N18, left eye where 612 N8. Vitreous is appeared, and besides all the usual finding we had at the last visit, there was a patch of an active lesion like a vasculitis patch or plus retinitis patch along the lower arcade. So this is how it looked like in the right eye. Macula had minimum amount of an macular edema kind of, and left eye was absolutely normal. There were few scattered hemorrhages in the mid periphery, and this got me suspicious ki this was not fitting into any particular thing kind of, and what we were suspecting till now. Montage photo showed some amount of an, again, the vasculitis changes in the right eye in the mid periphery. Left eye was absolutely normal. The peripheral parts were perfectly fine. She underwent FFA, and the FFA showed early disc staining with late disc staining at the end of an FFA. There were few hyperfluorescence at the vasculitis spots. Rest of the areas were normal, and there was some amount of an diffuse pooling at the macula in both eyes. So what it is, we have scratched everything, and ultimately I referred patient to my alma mater. Dr. JB and Dr. Partho has seen the patient, and they said ki even most of the things were inconclusive, and why not to start the patient on the antitoxo medications kind of. So we started patient with Ceptran DS along with the oral steroids, and after 3 weeks of the Ceptran DS completion of course, patient were on tapering doses of the steroid. The whole picture has reversed back. Visual acuity has come back to the 6/9 N6, but I did not have a guts to stop the steroids now. So patient for last 3 months is continuing with 20 milligram of the steroid kind of. And so I don't know what exactly has worked, whether it was anti-toxoplasma medication or continuation of the oral steroid. My differential diagnosis in her case was toxoplasma, sarcoidosis, retinal vasculitis, whether it's an intermediate uveitis or a viral retinitis, not very conclusive. So maybe the expert panel can share something on this kind of thing. Thank you.
If anybody wants to make a quick comment because we are running short of time.
Hello, doctor.
May I ask something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, how exactly? I mean, what's the duration for which you are giving those steroids? How rapidly are you tapering those steroids?
Weekly by 10 milligrams. So from 60 to 10, and maybe, I mean, some times when the complete resolution was not there, even the 10 was continued for 10 days and then 5 milligram for 10 days kind of.
Hello.
Patient really requires 3 immunosuppressive agents in simultaneously, then probably you could consider tapering the steroids a little slowly rather than 10 milligram every week. Second thing is, this looks more like a case of intermediate uveitis than frank vitritis. I mean, it is an intermediate uveitis case. And a publication by Foster's group from UK, I think although this was pediatric patients, intermediate uveitis, vitrectomy works actually pretty well in at least reducing the load of immunosuppressive agents. Instead of 3-drug immunosuppression, you might go away with, it might just give you 2-drug or 1-drug immunosuppression. And simultaneously, it might give you a vitreous biopsy specimen for, running further tests on it.
Yeah, so the last plan was same thing, that when the final recurrence happened, we were thinking about taking a vitreous biopsy. The only problem was like all the immunosuppressants were not able to control the inflammation, but the steroid alone was controlling it kind of. And so whenever steroid was given, the patient used to be absolutely quite kind of. And the moment we started to reduce, I mean to stop the steroid and maintain on immunosuppressant, recurrence used to be there again and again.
All right. Thank you, Yogesh, for that wonderful and interesting case. I once again like to thank the entire team for having this wonderful talks here. And thank you to Swapnesh and Ragini Madam for giving us this opportunity. The next speakers are already here. I think we'll hand over the call to them.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you. This was a wonderful session and very good presentations by everyone.